They told me it was just a drainage pipe, just a little adjustment, just water following the easiest path. But what they didn't realize was that the easiest path for them became the biggest mistake they ever made. Because the day my backyard started flooding, I didn't just discover a pipe under the ground. I discovered that my new neighbors had quietly decided my property was their solution. My name is Daniel Harper, and for 12 years I lived in a small lakeside community outside Cedar Hollow, Tennessee, in a brick ranch house that wasn't the biggest home on the street, wasn't the newest, and definitely wasn't the most expensive, but it was mine, and every corner of that place carried a little piece of my life. When I bought the house, the backyard was honestly nothing special. It was mostly uneven grass, a few struggling trees, and a muddy corner where rainwater always collected after storms. But I had always been the kind of person who couldn't leave things halfway done. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a problem. My wife used to joke that I could look at a crooked fence post from 200 feet away and somehow convince myself I needed to fix it before dinner. Over the years, I slowly transformed that backyard into something I was proud of. I planted native shrubs, built small garden beds, and in 2015 I designed a rain garden that helped control runoff naturally. I even spent nearly $6,000 installing an underground drainage system that connected properly to the county storm line. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Heavy rain came, water moved where it was supposed to move, and my yard stayed dry. There was something satisfying about that, knowing that I had taken a problem and solved it the right way. Then the Whitmores moved in uphill from me. Their names were Marcus and Elaine Whitmore, a couple who had relocated from Arizona after Marcus accepted a position with a software company nearby. Their house was beautiful, I'll give them that. They renovated almost everything within the first month. New siding, smart lighting, expensive landscaping, the kind of upgrades that made their home look like it belonged in a magazine. The first time Marcus introduced himself, he walked over with a confident smile and a handshake that felt less like meeting a neighbor and more like negotiating a business deal. "Daniel, right? I've heard you're the guy who knows everything about this area," he said. I laughed and told him I mostly just knew where the best fishing spots were and which roads flooded during storms. He smiled and looked around my yard. "We're planning some improvements, modernizing things a little. Better efficiency, better drainage. You'll probably notice the difference." At the time, I didn't think much about it. New homeowners always want to make changes. Some people repaint walls. Some people install pools. Some people replace landscaping. That's normal. Communities change. People invest in their homes. I actually wanted to believe Marcus was going to be a good neighbor. A few weeks later, he mentioned that his contractor was working on the driveway and upgrading the drainage system around his property. I nodded and told him that sounded like a smart idea because water management mattered in our area. Then I casually asked, "Did the county approve the drainage changes?" He laughed, almost like I had asked whether he needed permission to mow his own grass. "Oh, it's just water, Daniel. Nature doesn't need paperwork." I remember that sentence because something about it bothered me. Not because it was rude, but because it showed a mindset. The idea that rules only mattered when they were convenient. Still, I let it go. I figured maybe he just didn't understand how drainage systems worked around here. I wasn't looking for a fight with the guy who lived 50 yards uphill from me. But then came the storm. Not a huge storm. Nothing unusual for spring in Tennessee. Just a few days of heavy rain followed by a clear morning. I had been away for a short business trip, and when I came home, I noticed something immediately. My backyard looked different. The grass had a darker color. The soil looked heavier. At first, I thought maybe the rain had just been worse than I realized. But when I stepped onto the lawn, my boot sank slightly and water pushed up around the edges. I stood there confused because I knew my drainage system. I knew how my property handled rain. This wasn't normal. Then I saw it. A thin stream of water cutting across my garden, moving through the mulch, creating little channels where there shouldn't have been any. I followed the flow uphill, and that's when I saw the pipe. A white PVC pipe was sticking out from beneath Marcus Whitmore's retaining wall, pointed directly toward my land. The soil around it was freshly disturbed. The concrete was still clean. It wasn't old. It wasn't part of some forgotten system. Someone had installed it recently. Someone had deliberately aimed it at my backyard. I took a few pictures, then walked up to Marcus's house. He answered the door like nothing was wrong. "Hey, Daniel, what's up?" I pointed toward the slope. "Can we talk about the pipe behind your retaining wall?" For a second, his expression changed, but only for a second. Then he smiled. "Oh, that? Yeah, The contractor installed a better outlet for the driveway runoff. I looked at him. An outlet into my yard? He shrugged. It's all connected anyway. Water is water. That was the moment I realized we weren't having a misunderstanding. We were having a disagreement about whether my property was something he had to respect. Marcus, you can't redirect your stormwater onto another person's land. He leaned against the doorframe and smiled slightly. Daniel, you're overthinking this. Honestly, you've got that nice garden back there. Consider it extra irrigation. I remember standing there trying to stay calm because anger wasn't going to solve anything. But inside, I was frustrated. Not because my grass was wet. Grass can be replaced. What bothered me was the assumption behind it, the idea that because he had a problem, my property became the answer. I walked away without arguing. I didn't threaten him. I didn't yell. I didn't post about it online. I simply went back home, opened my phone, and started documenting everything. The pipe location, the angle, the direction of the water, the dates, the damage, because over the years I had learned something important. When people believe they can talk their way out of something, facts become your best friend. 2 days later, I called the county environmental office and requested an inspection. I honestly didn't know what would happen. Maybe they would tell me it was allowed. Maybe I was wrong. I was prepared to accept that. But when the inspector arrived and started walking the slope with his equipment, I could tell from his face that something wasn't right. He didn't say much at first. He measured the elevation, checked the flow path, looked at the pipe again, and finally shook his head. This pipe was never approved to discharge here, he said. They bypassed the proper storm system completely. I looked back at my yard, the same yard I had spent years improving, and I realized this wasn't just about water anymore. It was about responsibility. It was about whether someone could simply move their problem downhill and expect someone else to live with it. And Marcus Whitmore was about to learn that the easiest solution isn't always the legal one. The funny thing about situations like this is that people often think the moment someone calls the county, the person making the complaint is trying to start a war. That wasn't what I wanted. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I needed a new enemy. I had a job, a family, a home I enjoyed, and honestly, I had no interest in spending my weekends arguing with a neighbor about dirt and water. But there is a difference between creating conflict and refusing to accept someone else's decision to create a problem on your property. Once the county inspector confirmed that the pipe was not approved, I knew I had to let the process work. A week later, Marcus received an official notice that the drainage change was under investigation. I expected him to be angry, and he was, but not in the way I thought. He didn't come knocking on my door yelling. Instead, he sent me a carefully written email that sounded polite on the surface but carried the same confidence I had seen from him since day one. He said he wanted to resolve the misunderstanding between neighbors and offered to install what he called a decorative gravel swale along the edge of his property. The condition was simple. I needed to withdraw my complaint. I read that email twice because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He wasn't asking how he could fix the damage. He wasn't asking if my garden had been affected. He was asking if I would make the problem disappear. I sat at my kitchen table that night, looking out at the backyard, thinking about how strange the whole thing was. 12 years of maintaining that property, thousands of dollars invested, countless weekends spent improving something I cared about. And suddenly someone who had lived there for a few months thought a few sentences in an email could erase the consequences of his decision. I replied calmly. I told him I appreciated the offer, but I couldn't withdraw the complaint because the issue was bigger than my yard. The drainage system existed for a reason. If every homeowner decided to redirect water wherever it was convenient, the entire neighborhood would eventually suffer. His response came back almost immediately. I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. That sentence stayed with me because it perfectly described the entire situation. From his perspective, the problem was complicated only because I refused to accept the shortcut. A few days later, the county sent out a formal correction order. The language was clear. The unauthorized drainage pipe had to be removed, the slope had to be restored, and the water had to be redirected into the approved storm system. Marcus had 30 days to correct everything. When I received a copy of that order, I expected to feel some kind of victory, maybe satisfaction, maybe relief. But honestly, I mostly felt tired, because by then, I wasn't fighting Marcus anymore. I was watching a simple neighborhood issue turn into something much bigger because someone refused to admit they had made a mistake. That's something I think a lot of people misunderstand about these situations. They imagine the person who stands up for themselves is looking for revenge. But most of the time, you just want things to go back to normal. You want to wake up, drink your coffee, look outside, and not have to wonder what someone else changed while you weren't paying attention. For the next few weeks, things between Marcus and me were uncomfortable. We weren't exactly neighbors anymore. We were two people living near each other because our houses happened to share the same hill. Every time I saw him outside, there was this awkward silence. He would look over at my yard, then look away. I could tell he was frustrated, but I also noticed something else. He never once said, "I made a mistake." That sentence never came. Instead, he complained about the county. He complained about regulations. He complained that homeowners should have more freedom to improve their own properties. And I understood the frustration of dealing with government paperwork. Nobody enjoys bureaucracy. But there is a difference between paperwork slowing down a project and paperwork protecting people from making careless decisions. About 3 weeks into the correction period, Marcus stopped me while I was checking the rain garden after another storm. He stood near the property line with his arms crossed. "Daniel, you know this could have been handled differently," he said. I looked at him and asked, "How?" He paused for a moment. "You could have talked to me before calling the county." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I genuinely didn't know what else to say. "Marcus, I did talk to you. You told me water didn't need paperwork." He didn't respond. He just looked away. That was the first time I saw a crack in his confidence. Not anger, not arrogance, just the realization that maybe he had underestimated the situation. A few days later, I received a call from the county inspector asking if I would be home during the final correction. He explained that licensed contractors would be coming out to remove the pipe, repair the retaining wall, and restore the drainage path according to the approved plan. I agreed. When the morning arrived, I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the trucks arrive. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no movie-style argument in the street. And honestly, that made it even more satisfying, because the people who showed up weren't angry neighbors. They were professionals doing exactly what the rules required. The contractors placed survey stakes along the slope. The excavator carefully removed the illegal pipe. They opened the area around the retaining wall, repaired the damage, and rebuilt the grade so water would move where it was originally supposed to move. Marcus stood across the street watching everything. He looked different that day. Not defeated exactly, but smaller somehow. Like the confidence he had walked in with months earlier had finally met something it couldn't negotiate with. At one point, I heard him tell one of the workers, "This is ridiculous. We're spending thousands to fix something that was barely even a problem." The worker didn't argue. He just looked at him and said, "Sir, the problem is usually small until somebody else has to deal with it." I don't know if Marcus heard that the way I did, but I never forgot it. By sunset, my backyard was finally dry again. The water that had been cutting through my garden was gone. The grass looked normal. The rain garden was working exactly as it had before. I walked outside that evening and just stood there for a while. It was quiet, the kind of quiet I had missed, and I realized something strange. I wasn't happy because Marcus lost. I was happy because my home felt like mine again. But the story didn't end there, because a few weeks later, I started hearing from other neighbors. People began asking questions about drainage changes around the community. Apparently, Marcus wasn't the only homeowner who had made modifications without fully understanding the county requirements. His mistake had opened a much bigger conversation about how people treated shared systems, and that's when I realized this was never really about one pipe in my backyard. It was about something bigger. The idea that living in a community means your choices don't stop at your property line. Looking back now, the thing that surprises me the most isn't the pipe, the inspection, or even the money Marcus had to spend fixing everything. It's the fact that a small decision made in someone's backyard ended up teaching an entire neighborhood a lesson about responsibility. Because at the beginning, I thought this was just going to be a simple disagreement between two homeowners. I thought maybe Marcus would realize he made a mistake, call a contractor, move the water back where it belonged, and we would both move on with our lives. Honestly, that would have been the best possible outcome. I never wanted to fight. I never wanted to be the guy everyone pointed at and said, "That's the neighbor who reported someone." I wasn't looking for attention. I wasn't trying to prove I was smarter than him. I just wanted my home to remain the place I had worked so hard to protect. But sometimes, people don't understand the importance of a boundary until someone finally refuses to let them cross it. After the county finished the repairs, things were quiet for a while. The strange tension between our houses slowly faded. The contractors packed up, the equipment disappeared, and the hill between our properties went back to looking like any other ordinary slope in the neighborhood. If someone drove past, they would never know there had been a dispute there. They wouldn't know that a small white PVC pipe had caused months of frustration. They wouldn't know that a simple decision to redirect water had created a conflict that involved inspectors, permits, and county officials. They would just see two houses sitting next to each other. And maybe that's what made the whole thing feel so strange. From the outside, everything looked normal. But I knew what happened. I knew how quickly one person's convenience could become another person's problem. A few weeks later, I was outside replacing a few plants near the rain garden when Marcus walked by. At first, I thought he was just going to keep walking. That's what we had both been doing for months, pretending the other person wasn't there. But this time, he stopped. He looked down at the garden, then looked toward the slope where the pipe used to be. "You know," he said, "I didn't think it was going to turn into all of that." I put down my tools and looked at him. I didn't say anything because I wanted to see where he was going with it. He sighed and said, "When we moved here, I was trying to make the house better. I thought I was solving a problem." And for the first time since I met him, he sounded less like the confident businessman who always had an answer and more like a regular person who had made a bad decision. I told him, "I believe you were trying to improve your property, but the problem was that you solved your problem by creating one for someone else." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I didn't look at it that way." That was probably the closest thing to an apology I ever got from him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't some movie moment where someone suddenly admits they were wrong and everything becomes friendly again. Real life usually doesn't work like that. Sometimes people don't completely change. Sometimes they just understand one small thing they didn't understand before. And honestly, that was enough for me. Because the goal was never to make Marcus feel bad. The goal was to make sure it didn't happen again. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. Other neighbors started talking about drainage. People who had never paid attention to where water moved during storms suddenly started looking at their own yards. One neighbor told me, "I never thought about how my landscaping changes could affect someone downhill." Another told me they had checked their own permits after hearing what happened. In a strange way, Marcus's mistake started a conversation that probably should have happened years earlier. We all like to think of property lines as invisible walls. We look at a fence, a survey marker, or a line on a document and say, "This is mine, that is yours." But water doesn't care about those lines. Neither does noise. Neither does smoke, runoff, or a lot of other things people forget about until they become a problem. Living in a community means understanding that your choices travel farther than you think. That was the lesson I took from everything. The county didn't punish Marcus because he wanted to improve his home. They stepped in because the way he did it ignored everyone around him. There's a big difference between making your property better and making your neighbor pay the price for your improvements. A year later, my backyard looked better than ever. The shrubs had filled in. The grass was healthy again. The rain garden that I had built years before was still quietly doing its job every time a storm rolled through. Sometimes I would stand there after a heavy rain and watch the water disappear exactly where it was supposed to go. And every time, I thought about how close things came to being different. What if I hadn't noticed? What if I had ignored the wet ground? What if I had accepted Marcus's explanation that it's just water? Maybe nothing would have happened immediately. Maybe the damage would have slowly grown until fixing it became much harder. That's the dangerous thing about small violations. They rarely look serious at the beginning. A shortcut here, a small change there, a decision that seemed harmless because the person making it isn't the one dealing with the consequences. But eventually, those choices catch up with people, and when they do, they usually discover that rules aren't there to ruin their plans. They're there to prevent their plans from ruining someone else's life. So now, whenever someone asks me if I regret calling the county, my answer is simple. No, I don't. Because asking someone to follow the same rules everyone else follows isn't being difficult. It's being fair. I think communities work best when people respect each other's space, not because they are forced to, but because they understand that tomorrow they might be the person downhill. They might be the person affected by someone else's shortcut. They might be the person standing in their own yard wondering why nobody cared enough to stop it. And that's why I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have contacted the county? Or would you have tried harder to handle everything privately with your neighbor? Do you think Marcus was simply a homeowner trying to solve a problem? Or do you think he crossed a line when he redirected that water onto someone else's land? Where do you think the balance should be between personal freedom and community responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments because these situations are never as simple as they look from the outside. Sometimes it's about property. Sometimes it's about respect. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stand your ground. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who ignored boundaries, made changes without asking, or created a problem you had to solve, I'd love to hear your story too. Don't forget to like this video. Subscribe for more real-life neighborhood conflicts, unexpected justice stories, and lessons learned the hard way. Because sometimes the smallest decisions create the biggest consequences, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say, "This isn't right."